Um, so we're on Nun Tesam and Aleph. We're continuing the subject of Oinos Devarim, and last week we finished with the story of David HaMelech, Bathsheba, where we were talking about the whole Inyan of Oino, because he deliberately or inevitably was sure that her husband would wind up on the front in the battle, and more than likely he would be killed. So, and then we talked about a bohal eshishish misoso. And there we talked about a get al tanai, because they gave a get all the time with the idea that it's chal today, but it on manas that something happens, and if it doesn't happen, then the tanai doesn't come into play. And so she's was never divorced. And I guess Benasher, someone asked a question about the kahuna. What about a Kohen? Who, first of all, the Kohen wouldn't go out to battle. That would be a different question. But as a theological question, not a practical question, it wouldn't be a Gerusha, because the get al tanai was never chal. If the get is chal, and then you say, oh, he comes back, and now we're going to do something to sort of patch it up, then there's a question. Maybe the kohen, maybe it's a grusha, maybe not a grusha. I mean, again, philosophically, we're not there. But here the question is, when David HaMelech was with her, was she an Eishes Ish? Because at the time, do we know if Uriah was killed? Or we don't know. So the Gemara said that's why it's a Sophic Eishes Ish. It's not a Vadai Eishes Ish. It's a Sophic Eishes Ish as to whether or not a person was with a woman who at the time was married, because we don't know her marital situation.
It's almost a Schrodinger's cat situation.
Is what?
Like Schrodinger's cat. You don't open until you open the box. You don't know whether the cat's dead or alive.
That's right. Right. So, in any event, and then we concluded by saying that someone who's with an Eishes, of course, we say that so David said it was better that he would have misa b'chenek, where you're purged of your sin, and yesh l'chenek l'olam. Right, but when it came to Malbim B'nei Chavera Barabim, which was the subject of our discussion, Eilo Chelik L'Olam, because of the fact that the blood drains from his body, so we said that it's as if he killed him, and therefore Eilo Chelik L'Olam. So again, it's the power of these situations that the Gemara really wants to impress upon us. And of course, this whole section, including what we're going to learn today, is more in the category of Haggadah than it is, it's not lumdus. We're not learning halacha. We're not learning, basic, the kinds of halachas kind of Gemara we've been doing till now. This is more of a spiritual or sort of a different level of understanding of what the mitzvahs are. So in some cases, I remember the Rosh Yeshivas would always say, this portion of the Gemara we're going to go through quickly and then move on, because you can't delve too much into these aspects. They become very complicated. Complicated Gemara, where we have to understand a svara, okay, those are things we dig into and we really get our sort of our hands into it to understand. But when it comes to things like this, there's always more surface. We never really had a great deal of Mefarshim or a great deal of depth, other than just understanding what the Gemara is telling us. So we're up to now Va'omer Mazutra Batuvia Grauman, and again we're continuing along the same veins, talking about in this case we talk about embarrassing somebody. So Mazutra says in Rav Amalei Rav Chana Bar Bisna Amar Rav Shimon Chasida Amalei Amar Rav Yochanan Mishum Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So this is fascinating, because there's three different versions of who said it. And so it begs the question, why is that critical? Clearly we have to get it right. So therefore they have to say, it could be this one, it could be this one, it could be this one. And from this we learn that when a person says Torah, then it's always important. It's very important that he says it's b'shnei Amro. Of course, if he's saying his own Torah, but if he's repeating Torah, then the schus of what he's saying falls on the person who said it, who originated it, and therefore it's very important to say b'shem Amro rather than just I heard a Torah. If it came from if it was the Ramban, if it was somebody else, then always say it in the name. You see from this Gemara how makbid they are, because there's three different versions of who said this particular halacha. Okay, so what are they saying? Noach lo adam sheyapel asmo l'kivshan or eish. It's a better for a person to throw himself into a kivshan or eish, a furnace, a fire, a hot furnace. Again, the whole idea of impressing upon us how Malbim Pnei Chavero is such a terrible thing, but it cuts to the heart of the person. We're seeing that a person should allow himself to be thrown into a kivshan eish rather than embarrass somebody. Minolan, how do we know this? Because they were mitamar. Iksiv who motzos v'hisholcha es echamia, right? Famous story of Tamar, where she had the simonim from Yehuda, and she was about to be taken out to death. And rather than saying who it was, she said, whoever had these simonim, these the mashkin, the pledges that she has, he's the one who should step forward. And of course, Yehuda did the right thing. But you see how far we go that, again, in this particular case, and look, Tamar did what she did, but at the same time, she wasn't going to embarrass Yehuda and rather allow herself to be killed. So again, from here we take how important it is not to embarrass somebody, and especially onos devarim, which is what we're talking about, so that the power of speech is much more powerful, even in a negative way. We're talking about much more powerful than other averos. We have to be very careful.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
This to me is troublesome because it's factual. It may have been embarrassing, but the truth is it was factual. So she went to say he had to admit it himself.
Yeah.
By saying, not identifying whose they were. And is it better to lose a life under those circumstances when the truth be told? So it would not have been an Avera if she had to talk about the truth than to let her die and have him go with his death upon his conscience. But because embarrassing is where you're denunciating someone or you're putting them in a place that is there. But the fact is, this was truth to save her own life. So she had to put it that way. If he didn't come forward, she would have died.
Yeah.
So is that one? So I understand the conclusion.
No, I understand your
one is
question.
supposed to give up their life for this kind of situation.
Right. So that's exactly what the Gemara is telling us, is that you have to do what is the right way and then rely that someone else is going to do what they should do in the right way. In other words, if the Chazal tell us that embarrassing someone is so egregious that the ramifications are kares or are beyond the normal avera, then we adhere to that. We adhere to that. So therefore, Tamar did not want to be the one who called him out, because she felt, obviously, if she called him out, then it would embarrass him and it would be a malbim chavera. Now, did she expect him to do the right thing by showing the simonim? Of course she did. Of course she did. But if he hadn't stepped up, let's just say he hadn't stepped up. Your point is she's going to sacrifice her life because he didn't step up. that proves the point even more that Amal B'nei Chavero is a much more severe Avera than even Yarod Val Yavar, than even allowing yourself to be killed. As terrible as that is, of course, that you're allowing yourself to die, but yet the standard of Hamal B'nei Chavero is even more severe. So it may be a little difficult to grab that, but this is exactly what the Gemara is telling us: is that normally, I guess, in normal circumstance, when you're dealing with honorable people, Yehuda did what he had to do, but he wasn't embarrassed. In other words, he came forward of his own. That's not Hamalbin. It may have embarrassed him to do it, sure, but it wasn't someone else who was embarrassing him and Ke'ilu Kahargo, as if he murdered him. He did it on his own, and on his own, he's allowed to do it. Yeah, Jay.
But also, just to amplify what Michael said, the whole story is factually true. What she did and what he did. So we're talking about just keeping the secret,
right,
versus revealing it. But it was a fact of what he did. Right. Why does that have to be a secret? More importantly, than it can come out some other way. A year later, somebody might say something. Just because they did something together doesn't mean that nobody in the world saw about it or nobody in the world talked about it.
Right.
Because she's putting her life, just like Michael says. Why should she be dying because of something that he did? Because she didn't embarrass him. She's not trying to embarrass him. She's trying to live.
Right.
And what he did was his initiative. It didn't seem like it was her initiative to get together. It was something that he did.
And Rabbi,
that I could disagree with.
Yeah, because she
set
made
the whole thing up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
She
it's
made
very
it in
clear
this
in
case,
the
yeah.
Torah that she said
But
that.
Rabbi, here
Jay,
she
the
is.
point is that a Malvin doesn't have to be a fallacious statement. It can be a true statement. It's true what she's saying. We're not going to say that a Malvin is you're embarrassing somebody without a basis. There is a basis because they have done what you're saying they're doing. So it's not as if a Malvin is going to be just for someone or you're going to tell a tale and make it up, and therefore he's going to be embarrassed. It's Kila Hargo. No, it's based on factual information.
Doesn't she have a requirement to save her own life?
That's the point. Rabbi, she did not have Hasra, did she, before she committed this act? She was being put to death, and presumably she was asked to, if you have anything to say, to defend yourself.
Right, because this was not a Torah level based in. This was the civil law of the time, really.
Right.
But she's worried. I don't think God, certainly we don't want to embarrass anyone, but we don't want to take a life improperly. It's more
right. So let's put it into context, because remember, you're absolutely right. A person is mechuyev to save his own life and not to be killed, except for three things: gilu arayos, shvichas damim, and avodah zarah. Shvichas damim means murder, let's just say, or killing somebody. That's the exception to the rule that a person has to allow himself to be killed rather than kill somebody else. We are now saying that a malvin pnei chavero is shvichas damim, that when you embarrass someone and the blood drains from his face, that is the definition of shvichas damim. And shvichas damim is yarod val yavar. You have to allow yourself to be put to death and not be over. So to your point, you're right. Under any other circumstance, she wouldn't be allowed to sacrifice her life because her life is holy, it's sacred. But the exception of shvichas damim, which we're saying, amal b'nei chaveros, shvichas damim, that's what allows her to not say anything, put herself in jeopardy, and then Yehuda could have had a choice. Yehuda could have said, I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah, but that's not why she was being put to death. It was Gilai Arroyos, and it wasn't Gilai Arroyos because it was illegal. She should have been married to Yehuda,
Right, she should
And
have married
that
him.
relationship, and she went so far to try to follow the Torah, and then she's going to be put to death for something she didn't commit.
Well, it's not quite to follow the Torah; it's to follow the norms of the time. Because to follow the Torah, she was supposed to marry any of his children any of his sons who came along, and that was blocked in a number of different ways,
But that's
including by Yehuda, but not to actually marry Yehuda.
but
More
that's
later on with the halachas of
But,
Shlitza
but
and
it
Yibum, you
wasn't
would never marry.
prohibited for her to marry Yehuda.
At that time, it was not, and it was within the spirit of the law.
Right.
But-
And the
but-
point is she was trying to perform a mitzvah that in turn she was going to get killed for.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could look at it that way, but again, at the end of the day, what she could have done would have been a capital offense. In other words, what she could have done by outing Yehuda would have been the equivalent of shvichas damim.
Where does that linkage come from? Where do we find out that a person who gets embarrassed for 20 seconds is the same as killing?
Well, how do we know he would have been embarrassed? It was the truth, and we don't know that he would have been embarrassed.
Nah, he would have been embarrassed, but
Well, he was embarrassed in the end
He
anyway.
was,
because the
but
truth came out.
by admitting the situation,
But that's what he should have done beforehand.
Yeah, it takes some of the sting away by admitting rather than having it come out of nowhere. You know, someone's accusing you. I mean, that's we see this from our own society, that being accused of something egregious, people sort of blanch. If a person gets ahead of it, what do they always say to politicians? Get ahead of the story. Go ahead, confess it. I made a mistake. I have charata. I want to do tshuva. That's always the preferred way of getting by something very, very negative. But if you don't and you're caught in the act, then it's a terrible embarrassment. So Michael, what you're struggling with is the whole idea. And again, we know this, Jay, from Hamal B'nei Chavero Kil Hargo, because the Gemara tells us, which we learned a few weeks ago, that the level of the level of a person's reaction to something terribly embarrassing would be that the blood would rain from his face or from his appearance, and that is ke'ilu hargo. Chazal said that you didn't physically kill him, you didn't plunge a knife or do something else to him, but ke'ilu hargo, because what's the expression? We have an expression: you die from fright. Right. So that, I mean, it's merely an expression, but it sort of makes the point that sometimes having such a monumentous event that embarrasses a person it's frightful. It's beyond the norm.
But the word ke'ilu doesn't mean it's equivalent. It's analogous to it.
No, but ke'ilu means it's is as if. Because we know that shvichas damim is I come to you and you say you have to kill that person, otherwise you die.
That's not embarrassment. I mean, I don't understand how they define ke'ilu to be totally equivalent to one of the three averos. I mean, where did they have the authority to make that ke'ilu to be equivalent to murder?
Well, we say they had Ruach HaKodesh, that they were divinely inspired when they were writing the Torah Shebaal Peh, that it comes from Shemayim. It is divinely inspired. It's not something they made up as they went along. So we accept that as Torah min Shemayim, even though it was prepared and created. And we're going to see, not this week, maybe next week, the whole question of whether or not something that comes in the Shemayim or is created by an earthly domain, by Bezdin or whatever, whether they are the same. We'll get to that.
But there was no opposition. Opposition to that definition. The ke'ilu was taken 100% by everybody, by all Yisrael for this particular reason. There was nobody who argued against it.
Nobody said anything against it because they felt that that was the right way. In other words, they were unanimous in that. So there was no issue. So listen, we struggle with this.
I have a very strange question. Okay. Related to the embarrassing of somebody. As an attorney, if you're cross-examining somebody on a stand and he's Jewish, and you really stick it to them, and you catch them lying, and they know it, and they get all embarrassed, what's the ramification of that? Is that, I mean, you're doing exactly what they say we're not supposed to do.
Right, but it's also the circumstance of how and where they're doing it. Hamalvin is really in a vacuum. You come to somebody, or you make a pronouncement. You go in front of the city hall and you make a pronouncement. Such and such did so and so, and it embarrasses him, and all the things we talked about. When you're talking about a circumstance, whether it's a lawsuit or other things, where information comes out as a result of questioning, and your taina is, oh, but it's embarrassing him because he's caught. Yeah, but it's the circumstance under which it happens that creates the malvin. Malvin isn't in a vacuum. Oh, I say something to embarrass somebody, and therefore I'm chayiv misa because it's shvichas damim. That's not really the way we look at it. If it
Well,
is,
what about when somebody doesn't want to give a get to a woman? They actually harass the person. They're embarrassing.
That's not a malvin. That's not a malvin. First of all, there's a specific halacha that says that if a person doesn't want to give a get, is kofen osa that you really do have to force him any which way you can until he voluntarily gives the get, because the get has to be voluntary, not by force. But if you push him to the brink, he'll say, "Okay, I'm willing to give the get." But again, that's a different circumstance. It's not hamalvin because
Totally embarrassing.
Knows. It's not a question of what he is.
The whole town knows about somebody who doesn't want to give a get. It's embarrassing to the woman, embarrassing to the man when he says,
that's not a malvin.
He says, I want more money to give a
Right.
get. I mean, all of this stuff that goes on today,
Exactly.
it's totally embarrassing.
Rabbi, go back to the straight situation.
They don't view it as
No.
She had to take his signet ring and evidence that was him because he didn't do what he had promised to do beforehand, and she needed to hold it so that she could, at the point where her life was in jeopardy, because she knew it might be, have to present those items.
No, but it wasn't about that, oh, I'm going to do this so that if my life is in jeopardy, I'll be saved. She did this deliberately to make a public point of who it was. She knew this would happen. It was deliberate.
But isn't that embarrassing him making?
Yeah,
she planned
that's why this is all an issue.
to do that. So then she actually came out and did it. So she had planned, she had foresight to do that. But she also in her mind knew that he might not step up if it was not pointed out to him to be able to do that. So it was in that point creating an embarrassing situation, but it enabled HaKadosh Baruch Hu to step in and allow her to present and defend herself to save her life and to save Yehuda's life for not killing her in error. So there's a lot of forethought that went into this, and even the presentation of that is embarrassing.
Yeah,
even though she didn't say it. So we've got to distinguish, to draw a line, as David and Jay were doing with other examples of that. So I mean, he was ultimately embarrassed by having that show, but he wasn't embarrassed by her saying it, but by intimating that if the person will step up, then I will be saved. So that was an embarrassment. She had the foresight to do all that, and she knew that it would come to that. So we're splitting hairs here a lot.
I think that it's more than just that she knew it would, even that she knew it would likely come to that. She didn't know for sure. But in order for her son to carry on the name of Yehuda, which was the whole point of this, it had to be public, because otherwise A prostitute having a child, there's no way without such a thing. Yeah, okay, if he'd gone ahead and done the payment quietly, without her having to do all that, she would have gotten her payment, but she would not have managed to do what she wanted to do, which was to show that the line of Yehuda was carried on.
So she did what she did to have to perform the mitzvah
Yeah.
that wasn't performed. And how is that embarrassment? She did what was the essence of what God, and I understand we didn't have the Torah at the time, but what was supposed to be done, she
Right.
did everything there, and we're concerned.
But look at the
He's going
stature
to
of
be
Yehuda.
embarrassed one way or another, whether she reveals his name or shows the stuff and he steps up or doesn't step up, he's still going to be embarrassed. So this was to save a life, which to me trumps that situation.
What I'm saying is it's more than just to save a life. It was in order to do that mitzvah.
Right.
Yehuda could have
You're right,
avoided
you're
the
right,
whole
Menashe,
thing by
you're right.
giving his youngest son
Yes,
over to
yes.
marriage.
That's even more important. That's right. So I don't understand how we can make this comparison in this situation.
Well, it's the stature of Yehuda, of course, that we were talking about. If it would not have been Yehuda, it would have been somebody else. Then coming forth, even revealing something, might not have been an embarrassment. I mean, it might not have been embarrassment.
Well, it might not have been an embarrassment to Yehuda either.
Yeah, but to Yehuda, because he was a great, he was a leader in Klal Yisrael, we certainly can assume that,
Yeah, but we don't. The Torah doesn't make that distinction. Maybe in the case of a melech it does, but nobody else.
Yeah. Well, again, the classic case that we talk about is the case of David HaMelech,
which I have a real problem with too, and we talked about it yesterday's Shiur in Sanhedrin that cites this Gemara in Bava Metzia.
Right.
So I mean, the whole thing. It's a little problematic situation.
I'm not going to say it's not complicated, Michael, but at the end of the day, the Chazal, in their wisdom, they came forward and said that Hamal Chavero is of the same standard as Shvichas Damim, and Shvichas Damim is Yarek Val Yavor, and therefore, in sort of the black letter of the law, you have to allow yourself to be killed rather than be over of Shvichas Damim, i.e., Mal Pnei Chavero. So you're taken aback by the severity of it. I understand that. But
no, I actually agree with that description. But in a case where you're trying to avoid one of the three averos, which is not the avera, to save a life and to perpetuate the family, as you're supposed to be doing, that this would be cited in that context is erroneous to me.
Yeah. Listen, it'd be a good shalit to ask a posek, especially in that period of time, and say, explain to me how what's going on here is okay. Tamar is being righteous, and she's going to die because she's not going to reveal the name. So, morally speaking, how do we reconcile? I mean, this would be the shalit to ask the Bezdin and say, explain to me how all of this makes sense. Like you just said, when you have competing interests, you have mitzvahs on the one hand that have to be performed. If she dies and the mitzvah isn't performed, I mean, you've got a lot of competing interests. I agree.
Yeah, but, there's another thing which is on one hand, on the other hand, might support this idea of that this was extra embarrassing, which is that this is following the whole, in the whole situation with Dina and Shlem and a number of other things with the Avos with pretending that their wife was their sister, etc. All these kinds of things all point to this idea of Bnei Yisrael being and the Avos all being like above reproach when it comes to these sexual moral issues, and yet this goes the pole appears on the surface to be the total opposite, even though it turns out that Tamar was actually doing the right thing and it was really just pretend in a sense. And so, if this had happened to some other prince in some other group in the seven nations and whatever, it wouldn't be embarrassing at all. Just about. I mean, so it was the fact that it was somebody from Bnei Yisrael that made it so embarrassing, and yet that was the whole the whole point. So I'm still with Michael on this.
Yeah, again, very hard for us to wrap ourselves around this, that to this extreme, a person has to allow himself, in this case, to go to the kitchen age. But again, this is Chazal. This is a Chazal giving us the extreme, and it probably is not likely to come to fruition, but at least to understand that in this context, there is such a thing, which, in a sense, gives us like a Musa Haskell today in our lives to be careful not to embarrass somebody, because embarrassment is a very, very terrible thing, and it's an avera. And again, if someone knew to what extent embarrassment can cause pain, then they wouldn't do it. So this is the Gemara giving us that sort of a premature as a Musa Haskell not follow that road. All right, and there's a lot to talk about, but these are good questions as to how we can ultimately reconcile. But in any event, so again, this is an example of Anoras Devarim, of speaking and causing this kind of pain, and therefore we say that a person should be careful not to do that. Okay. So again, along those lines, we'll go a little bit further. Rav Tananya Edi. So Rav Tananya said in the name of Rav Edi, Lo sonu ish es amiso. So again, it's a pasuk in Vayikra that a person should not. Again, how do you define lo sonu? He shouldn't do wrong. He shouldn't sin against his fellow man. Lo sonu ish es amiso. So, what is the explanation for that? What does that mean? So, Gemara says, "Am she'itcho b'torah of mitzvahs al tonehu." So now we're going to narrow it down, and we're going to say that when it says you shouldn't do wrong to your fellow man, it refers to not everybody. It refers to a fellow person in Torah mitzvahs, meaning that we know there's all kinds of Jews. They're all Yidden. Some are more religious, some are less. But for purposes of this pasuk, it narrows it down to those who are Torah and mitzvahs Jews. Again, we're going to see that it doesn't exclude other Jews, but this particular pasuk is in reference to not below some. You shouldn't do a wrong to a person who, like you, is a ben Torah mitzvahs, and therefore the Anoras Devarim that you would say to him would be of great, would be very egregious. So that's the source of how we get to Anoras Devarim. We're going to Rav Chanina Ravidi. So, having said that, we see that let me look at the pasuk here. I have the pasuk in Devarim. It says, "Lo sonu ish es amiso, v'yoreisem elakecha, ki ani Hashem Elokeichem." So again, we ask the question: where does the v'yoreisem elakecha come in about lo sonu? So as we said previously, that the Rabbanu Shalom has an active interest, and when you embarrass a Talmid Chacham, then you're really he has Torah Hashem, he has the Torah and mitzvahs. Then you're really doing something very, very improper, and for that you are punished. Now,
Rabbi, why does it matter if it's a Talmid Chacham or just a regular Yid or an Amoritz or even a Goy? If you're acting that way and embarrassing someone, you're not supposed to do that. So why is it more egregious to do it to someone who has a higher stature?
So it's an interesting question, because when it comes to the question of onos mamon, we say that every Jew is alike. In other words, if you're going to defraud someone with mammon, doesn't matter whether he's an Amoritz, a Talmud Chacham, a bad guy, a good guy, it doesn't matter. I know is I know. But when it comes to Einos Devarim, the Gemara the Torah is telling us that Einos Devarim is more acute when you're dealing with someone of the stature of Torah and mitzvahs. Yeah, look, someone else might be embarrassed anyway. That's not to say you wouldn't, but the specific halacha of Malbim Pnei Chavero, from this pasuk we learn that it deals not with any person, any Jew. And again, we're talking about Yid, right? I mean, a non-Jew doesn't fall into the category of a Malbim Bnei Chavero. It's not the right thing to do. It's not nice. It's not menschlich, but it's not to the level of a Malbim Bnei Chavero if you're doing it outside of to a non-Jew, let's say. But even to another Yid, there is a standard that a person who is Mekayim Torah mitzvahs has a greater sensitivity. Again, this is what the Gemara is teaching us based on halacha, that's the fact. Now you could say, is it really a fact? Because other people have feelings too. Of course they do, Michael. People have feelings, and they would feel badly if you said something about them. But to the level of Hamalbin, to the level of Shvichas Damim, which is a very, very, it's a very unusual and very high mountain to climb, that only applies to a Talmud Chacham or a Torah mitzvah Jew, and not to anybody else. So,
Rabbi, is that exclusively to men and not to women? Because I've never heard of women termed Talmidei Chachamim. So, I mean, are we being really restrictive here?
It's an interesting question, because you're right. This is not halacha that necessarily deals with women.
Look at the wife, the provision about the wife next.
What's that?
Look at the next provision about hurting the wife.
That's a whole other part. You're right. We're going to get that in a minute. So, but as to this point here, whether someone is Malbin B'nei Chavero, does that apply to a woman? Not necessarily a wife, but even to a woman, if you're
observant of Torah mitzvahs and even has great knowledge.
Right.
She could be.
They're not called Talmidei Chachamim.
No, they're not called Talmidei Chachamim. They are fulfilling Torah mitzvahs in any event. It's an interesting question. I don't have a specific answer, Michael, to tell you. Obviously, we're dealing in the realm of men here, mostly, of course. But the question is, there are a lot of halachas that seem to be directed only at men, but yet the halacha applies to women as well. So it bears further scrutiny of whether or not such a halacha applies to women if you're Malbim B'nei Chavero, because all the examples of the Torah are all about men. You're right. David HaMelech, or in this case, Tamar and Yehuda, but all wherever the subject comes up, the man is the object of the Malbin, of the embarrassment, not the woman.
Today you have many women who are teaching Torah in all the yeshivas. It's very common to find women who have really, they would be called Talmidei Chachamim. Maybe
well, I mean, in the times of the Torah and the times of Chazal, there were a handful of women, Devorah, for instance, who was a judge, and others who had that stature, not the common person, but who have that stature. And again, so the question is, if you would say something to be Malbim, someone like Devorah, as an example, just right. is that
well, even Tamar? I mean, isn't what Yehuda did an embarrassment to Tamar, that she would be considered a lady of the evening? Because her purpose was not to do that. Her purpose was one goal in mind.
Yeah, he's not embarrassing her. She set this up.
Wait a minute. She set it up for halachic reasons, because she believed that.
All right. I'm not arguing with her. I'm saying, so she's the one who comes out and says, "Oh, this thing." At that point, she's already said about herself of what she quote pretended to be.
Well, you
You know,
raise a good point, Menashe.
But
It's
she's
not
American.
doing something to let someone believe that somebody's done something wrong. They haven't overtly embarrassed them, but they are leaving them in a position of embarrassment. Is
Well,
that embarrassing?
yeah. Well, so
She's embarrassing herself.
yeah. So David points to the next Gemara, which doesn't directly answer this question, but I think it's worth shifting and learning this next piece, because not that it'll answer this question, but it'll shed some new light on the issue of Ainos Devarim with regard to a woman. Okay, first it starts by Ishto, but also talking about other women as well. And again, I think some of you are going to take umbrage at this as well, because this is not what is common. But let's just see. Amara, right? So now we're pivoting from the general subject of Oinos Devarim to Oinos Devarim when one deals with a spouse, with his wife. Okay, Omarav. A person has to also be very careful about Oinos Devarim with regard to his wife. So now this is a statement that says that it's not just the words that you're going to say, but because it will cause her to come to tears, dim also mitsuya, that she will be more likely to come to tears. Therefore, oinasa karova, therefore the oinah, the punishment is very quick in coming. So well, let's analyze this for a minute, because some people will say, "Wait a minute, this is sexist, or it's not the way we normally." I mean, maybe yes, maybe no, but Chazal understood that that the difference between a man and a woman when it comes to sort of psychological and maybe the mental capacity. I'm not saying it in terms of more or less smart, but in terms of the way someone reacts to difficulty, that a man would react one way and a woman would react another way. A man would react with toughness, with he'd be gruff, he'd push back. So therefore, maybe the level of embarrassment is much higher because maybe he's not as sensitive. But the idea is that a woman is more sensitive, and therefore, dim also mitsuya. Now, many women will take exception to this. Oh, you mean because you said something to me, I'm going to start crying right away? That doesn't carry very far these days. But the fact that the Chazal tell us that is something that is the difference between a man and a woman means that Ainos Devarim. Here we're talking about Ishto, but then we're going to go into the question of women generally. Ainos Ishto is the Ainos Kareva, the punishment doesn't take long to take effect, because Dima, tears, is something that Rabbi Shalom reacts to. Now, let's just look at this Gemara and then we'll talk about it. Amar Rabbi Lazar. So says Rabbi Lazar, Miyom Shedech Beis Hamikdash, from the days that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Nikalu Sharei Tefillah. Then the heavenly gates, the Sharei Tefillah, the gates of prayer that were open to everyone because of the Beis Hamikdash were shut down. In other words, Tefillah was not as readily an antidote for someone doing something wrong, because the Rosh Hashanah wasn't accepting tefillah. Beis Hamikdash is closed. It's like the Reform Synagogue gets closed on account of the holiday. The holiday is over, and therefore you can't daven anymore. That was the perception of what the Beis Hamikdash gave to all of us, right? So how do we know this? Shenemar gam ki ezak v'ashaveya shosam tefilasi. Okay, so the pasuk there says that when a person would do tefillah, the Baruch Shalom would silence him. In other words, I'm not accepting the tefillah. But afal pi shari tefillah nigalu, even though the shari tefillah were closed. Share de mos lo nigalu. The gates of Shemayim for tears, for tears, lo nigalu were not closed. How do we know? Shenemar Shimot Pilosi Hashem B'Shavosi Ha'azina El Dimosi Al Techlash. So this was a case where David HaMelech was saying that to Rabbi Shalom, listen to my tefillos, and of course Rabbi Shalom wouldn't want to listen to the tefillos, but then he went on and said, but you won't be, but the Mosi Al Techlash, to my tears you won't be deaf. In other words, you'll be deaf to my tefillah. I understand. You've said that the Sharmi tefillah are closed, but to my tears, so David HaMelech is sort of piercing the veil and saying, Rabbi Shalom, you still have Rachmanis on tears. And then, so what's the point? Omar Rav, and Rav, who made this point before, it says Rav, so here, that the point was that Dima, which is more identified with the woman than with the man, is still open to Shemayim. Therefore, oinoos devarim to his wife or to a woman in general, but to oinoos devarim is much more severe because the Rebbeinu Shalom is still accepting tears as an egregious event for the Rebbeinu Shalom to intervene. Again, this is I got it at a different level for us to really perceive, but the point is that you see that. And again, to the question that was asked, you asked earlier, Michael, about a woman, whether or not Hamal Chavera applies, it would seem from this Gemara that we don't say how Malbin applies, and that's still a question that whether or not it rises to the question of Hamal Pnei Chavero, but certainly you would be over an Isser of Oinoah. Now, Oinoah is not Malbin. I mean, the Malbin Pnei Chavera is again, we're saying that's one of the cardinal principles of Shvit and David. But Oinoah, which is the more common Avera of wrongdoing bepeh, does apply to a woman, and in many cases applies to a woman in circumstances where it wouldn't apply to a man. So if you said something that was offensive to a woman but not to a man, then there would be no if you no isser on what you said to the man, but there would be an isser on what you said to the woman. That the Gemara is making a distinction, but not to the level of a Malbin that we talked about before. That's why I said let's hold off for a minute, because this Gemara introduces the whole question of dealing, quite honestly, dealing with men and women differently. That it's like the president has reintroduced man and woman. It's a great finish, right, to all of us that there's a man and a woman and not anything else. But the fact of the matter is that you see from Chazal that that there was a primary track that the Gemara talks about, of course, is for men, but doesn't exclude women from the category of someone who can be punished for doing wrong. The other question might be, what happens if a woman is the person who is the wrongdoer? In other words, it's the woman who is not the victim, but the perpetrator, right? The one who is saying the Oinah or doing the Malbin, if you will. So how do we look at that? Now, from the story of Tamar, I think it becomes clear that whether she knew it or not, okay, they were on a different level, but whether she knew it or not, had she called him out and was Malabin Mirabim, then at least from the Gemara, we deduce that she would be chayiv, that she would be over the lav of a Malbin, because using the example of Tamar, by definition tells us that she rose to a level where she did not want to embarrass him. Why? Because the repercussions of embarrassment are shvichas damim. So that's how you have to look at it. Whether or not, as a practical matter, she would have been chayiv misa, or whether the mitzvah of Yared Val Yavar applies to her. It's again at her level. Tamar, the question. It seems to me that Tamar would have been a chayiv in the same way that a man would be chayiv if she had embarrassed him barabah. But when it comes to things that are not malbin, this Gemara that we just talked about embarrassing a wife or a woman is not the level of a malbin b'nei chavero. It's just Ainos Devarim saying things that make someone react negatively. And in this case, he's making the point that for a man, what you just said, man, no big deal. But if you say to a woman that because she is more easily brought to tears, and tears is still something that Rabbi Shalom is affected by. He may not be affected by your tefillah, but he's affected by tears. Therefore, Ainos Devarim for women is at a different level than it is for men. So,
Rabbi, I have two questions on that basis. One on the Tamar situation, but that implies that she can embarrass him, but he cannot embarrass her. So Malbim doesn't come to that level where he would embarrass her, but on the other hand, she can embarrass him. Is that the conclusion correctly based on what you interpreted?
You mean if Yehuda had embarrassed Tamar?
Yep.
Okay, so how would he embarrass her? Let's.
Well, he did embarrass her. He embarrassed her by not owning up until she called him on it.
No. There was when they found out that she was pregnant, and they said that she's chayiv misa. That wasn't Hamalbin. That was strictly a case of she violated she was an age. Well, technically she wasn't, but she was an age because her husband had died. But they wanted to put her to death because she violated. She didn't get chalitza. So again, in those days, the halacha is very different. So she may technically have still been an Eish until either chalitza or yibum happened, and therefore they said, so the punishment for an Eish is we have to stone you. Okay, so but that's not a malbin. That's not a malbin.
But wait a minute. If he knew that and didn't come forward until she said what she said,
so he wouldn't have been chayiv malbin. He might have been chayiv in other ways for not protecting her. Yes, I don't disagree. But there could be something else that if this story hadn't ended this way and Yehuda had allowed her to be killed because of this, then we have to look into it. But Yehuda clearly is not exonerated from any lav, but by what he did, because what he did, in fact, not that it's the right thing to do, but in a sense, if Yehuda was an almond, right? Yehuda was a widower, and if his son did not ultimately, Sheila did not ultimately marry Tamar, then the Chazal say that he is the next Goel. In other words, even though he's the father
and this is before the Torah was given. So
right. So he did in a sense have not a right, but he was in line to right.
And the fact that he did not step forward because it took her calling him out,
right?
He would not be subject to the same punishment.
No, not to
death.
Because it wasn't. No, you're right. He wouldn't be subject to the same punishment because it wasn't a malbim, but he would be subject to the punishment of allowing, quote unquote, an innocent woman. All right, okay, but allowing a woman to be put to death under circumstances where she should not be put to death. But that he has an achrayas. But it's not a malbim.
It still implies that a woman can be subject to that restriction on malbin, but a man to a woman cannot. So it only goes away because
forget about the story of Yehuda and Tamar. If a man
but I'm saying because of the designation of Talmud Chacham.
So you're back to Talmud Chacham. All right. So there it says Torah mitzvahs, right? So the question is, does the term Torah or mitzvahs apply to a woman as well, that she would be considered amiso? When it says losones amiso, does amiso refer to a woman as well as a man?
So as you pointed out, Tamar in that situation would have been subject to miso because of what she did to a great man, a Talmud Chacham. But on the other hand, the reverse is not true. But then I want to go back to one other thing on the most recent Gemara, which I don't understand. That I understand the quote, but I thought that once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, that, I mean, we see everything was introduced into tefillos. So whether it's korbanos or everything like that, so we can't actually enact what we did, but we did that. But God doesn't accept prayer, but we introduced all that into tefillah. So how does that, is that only that situation that he does not allow tefillah, or is that a blanket statement? I don't get that.
Okay, so now we're touching again. This is why this whole subject matter is very difficult to study and understand in depth, because you're right. How do we understand Rabbi Elazar's statement that Mishachar Beis Hamikdash Nigalu Shari Tefillah, but there's no longer an acceptable path of tefillah for the Rebbeinu to listen to? Everything that we know and are taught is exactly the opposite. Is that tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, that all these things are of great moment and can change the whole trajectory if you do it properly. So grappling with that is a little bit difficult, especially that it comes from Rabbi Elazar, who we will see later on. There was a baskol, just to get ahead of it, there was a baskol that came from Shemayim that said that whatever Rabbi Eliezer says, his psak halacha is the absolute halacha. So there's a whole discussion later on. How could that be? There's the Chazal. Many of the Rabbanim were against Rabbi Eliezer. Again, I'm only mentioning it because this statement is on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that the Sharei Tefillah were closed once the Beis Hamikdash was nachrab. So how do we reconcile that with everything that we know? So again, this is a difficult subject. We know that even though Rabbi Eliezer says what he says, that the Chazal later on established, the Amshik Knesset Agdola established that tefillah was a important form of the relationship between Rebbeinu Shalom and Klal Yisrael, and therefore tefillah should be something that we continue, notwithstanding this Gemara. So sometimes, the Gemara makes a sort of a black letter statute and says something which later the Chazal softened up and said, no, we didn't quite mean it. It wasn't exactly that you can't be mispalel. So again, I can't clearly give you an answer, Michael, of what the rationale is for saying it, but the fact of the matter remains is that in this context, it wanted to show us that the power a woman had in her tefillah, i.e. demos, the crying, which is a form of tefillah. That's the point here, is that demos is a form of tefillah, that her demos, her tefillah was accepted and a man's was not accepted. And therefore there's a different standard of vainos devarim to a man and to a woman. So again, that's the chiddush of, and this Gemara will go on further to discuss this. But again, we're dabbling in things, Michael, that are a little beyond our understanding. And I wish we had answers to all the questions, but truly we don't.
It's puzzling because David HaMelech, it said he cried to Hashem and God listened to him because he cried. So it wasn't only available to women, or was it because he was the Melech that he cried? But then to say that, to make the statement that after the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, that tefillah doesn't have any impact, that God said, it doesn't make sense in the context, like you said, of everything we do today.
So I'm just looking at the Lashon. that the Gemara brings down by David Melech, it doesn't actually bring down that he cried. He said to the Ravana Shloim, "B'tzalei samchu v'nesafu v'lo domu." He didn't use the term. He didn't use the term crying. He said that when I was B'tzalel means when I was vulnerable. Samchu, my enemies were misameach v'nesafu, and they tore at me v'lo domu, and they wouldn't be silenced. They wouldn't be quieted down. So he uses a different lashon, and he doesn't. The lashon of demos doesn't really. In this context that we're talking about, there was no demos by David HaMelech. I have to look at the whole parak in Tilim, but at least from what the Gemara tells us, this portion was not affected. Would it be affected?
Rabbi, this was the first base of English. So what happened in between, and you had a second base of English, doesn't mean that the second one was closed the way it mentions the first one. It could have been opened up again, and that's why we have all the tefillas since those days.
Oh, so you said Mishyom Shachar Beis HaMikdash refers to the first Beis HaMikdash.
Right. It didn't mean the second one as well. It didn't say words like that. So whatever happened between the two Batei Mikdashim, I guess, when the Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael for the second Beis HaMikdash, it doesn't mean the statement about the first was automatically carried to the second. Otherwise, it's a very big question. How can we have tefillas for the last couple of thousand years that everything said we believe in it? So something must have changed, I would guess.
Right. So I think one of the ways to look at this is the Chazal tell us, again, I was talking to David Hornstein before we got started about the question of Kares and the differences. Talked last week about Kares and Ganim, and that even Kares is not, as he used the term we know the Christians use, eternal damnation. Kares is not eternal damnation, because even though it's an excommunication, but at some point the neshama is restored. That's the rachim of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So we're not talking about you are forever in the netherworld and there's no chance of tshuva. I think the same thing applies here, is that by tefillah, when it says that the sharei tefillah were closed, you're right, Jay. It doesn't mean that forever tefillah doesn't play a role in a person's life. Of course it does. What it means is, whereas with the Beis HaMikdash, tefillah was the Rosh readily accepted your tefillah as tshuva and gave you, a pardon, or you knew that your tefillah would sort of put everything in the balance. He shut the door, so it's not so easy. You can't just come and be mispalel and say, I'm being mispalel, and therefore everything is good. No, the Sharei Tefillah over the course of time will penetrate into the Sharei Shemayim, but not so easy. Sharei Demos, on the other hand, a tears and crying, that has no barrier. That goes right up to Shemayim, and therefore the Rosh says that Enosa Krova, as the Gemara says the language, the punishment for violating demos, tears, is very quick. That happens right away. Whereas with Sharei Tefillah, it's not right away. So you make a good point. It's not forever closed. Yeah, the Beis HaMikdash made the change that Tefillah is no longer the easy way to get to the Rebbeinu Shalom. He's going to give you hard to get, Kaviyachol. It's not happening so fast. You got to do a lot more to earn the right for your tefillah to be accepted. I think that's the correct way to look at it. But you're right, not that the Sharei Tefillah are forever closed, because we know that's not the case. As to whether it was just the first or second Beis HaMikdash, that I'm not sure, is whether or not this lashon applied only to the first Beis HaMikdash and then later on it opened up and didn't close, or whether even with the Mishkara Beis Hamikdash, meaning Beis Hamikdash Sheni,
When
still
the second base of Migdash was dedicated, and all the ceremonies related to opening it up again,
right.
there
Yeah,
must
the
have been.
question of whether tefillah was blocked in the second Beis Hamikdash as in the first, that again, I have no reason to believe otherwise, but
The ceremonies at the second base of Migdash opening for the Bnei
Right.
Israel, everybody there has to be, you have to sort of say, well, tefillah, of course, is back. Otherwise,
right. But
what
what happened with Shenichra when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed? Then the Shari Tefillah again get closed out because
you
that
don't have
second
to
Beis Hamikdash.
put the second state up for hundreds of years and there with tefillos every day.
Between the first and second. But I'm saying, what happens after the second Beis Hamikdash is destroyed? Does this same principle apply? That, or is it only after the first, and therefore tefillah came back even after the second it came back? It's not clear what he's referring to here when he says we should.
But unless you can find a Gemara that says the same thing happened in the second base.
Right, exactly. So
and it didn't happen the second time.
Yeah. So
Absence of anything that said the same words by the second base of Migdash when it was destroyed, then it never happened. There was no breakage of the opening so people can have tefillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Yeah,
and that's the way we live for the last almost 2,000 years.
yeah, right. No, but yeah, 100%. But I think the question of tefillah being blocked doesn't mean being blocked, period. It means it's a lot harder. That's the point. It's a lot harder to get to the Ravana Shalom with tefillah than it is with you.
Tefillos from the Elah really represent the fact that the gate is the doors being closed.
Right, and we want the Ravana Shalom to hear our tefillos. Exactly.
That whole season of tefillos and tshuva and tzedakah is
right.
ending
Absolutely.
as
So
a season.
it makes it. It's a little incongruous, but and maybe you're right. Maybe it only referred to the first base on Mikdash. We'll take a look and see if there's anything. A good place to look at might be in Eov, because Eov talks a lot about this question of the Ravana Shalom not listening to prayers. So there may be something in Eov that gives us some clue as to whether or not there was a filik between the Bayis Rishon and the Bayis Sheni. So we'll have to take a look at analyze that a little bit further. But again, everything we've learned here today, it's clearly it opens to a lot of questions and a lot of sort of mind searching as to what's right and what's not. Because when you balance, as Michael was very aptly representing Tamar in this particular case, how do we reconcile that? That if Yehuda hadn't said it, he would have gotten away with it. Would he not have gotten away with it? The Teretz says he wouldn't have gotten away with it, but it wasn't Hamalvin. These are all issues that are very. I mean, they're. It's not something that we can plumb the depths and say, okay, we understand a Gemara, we understand the two sides. They're very difficult. This is a very difficult subject generally to get our arms around, and therefore, as I say, that's why we in most of the times in yeshivas and other places, they're not studied with the same depth that one would study a regular Gemara, because they have these, I will say, incongruous concepts that are hard to understand. It's hard to understand sometimes what Chazal is telling us.
Well, it was in Yehuda's interest to confess, because if he didn't, and this woman was put to death, so would his descendants. He would not have descendants.
That's a very good point.
We wouldn't have had King David.
Right.
Well, he wouldn't know that, but he would just feel for, losing a grandchild.
Yeah.
That's it's a good point. And was that in Yehuda's cheshbon? Did he cheshbon? I've got to come to light here. I've got to make sure this is clear because I can't allow her to die.
Yeah.
Aside from the thing that it would be wrong for him, forget about whatever.
Right, yeah.
Whatever Avera he would have. But your point is that he couldn't stop the bloodline. He had to allow her to live in order for David
Right.
to shine. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a fascinating Gemara. And as we get, and we're in the middle of it because there's a lot more to go into to this on this whole subject of anor by women, anor by men, and how we look at it. And then of course there's the Gemara. Once we get through that, you're going to see how the Gemara talks about the machlokes of Tanoim, and you'd be amazed and to see that the relationship between the Tanoim wasn't always as cordial as you might think it was. In other words, oh, sure, it's one happy family, they're all Tanoim, we get together. Apparently, in the time of the Tanoim, there was a great deal of strife in terms of psak. And again, I mentioned this Baskol. The Gemara is going to tell us that a Baskol came from Shemayim to say that the halachas Rabbi Eliezer even against a rabbin. And then the kasha is, how could that be? We have a halacha after rabbin lahatos, right? That we follow the majority. How can you follow the majority when the Rebbeinu is telling us that Rabbi Eliezer, who's a yochid, he rules? Again, not so simple. That's what I'm saying. These are all areas where we learn it, but we don't learn it with the depth that we would learn a regular Black Gemara because it gets into deep thinking here that we're not necessarily equipped to be able to. Sure, we can talk about it as we do here, and it's terrific, but we're not necessarily equipped to fully understand the depths of what the Chazal are telling us here. So, in any event, the bottom line from this we learn, of course, no matter how you look at it, is that Eidos Devarim is a very terrible thing, and that a person's speech has to be very measured. And even though the pasuk deals with only Talmidei Chachamim, Torah mitzvahs, we should go a little bit further beyond that. As certainly in terms of the Zman Hazeh, is that we should not violate this even for people who are not Talmidei Chachamim, and you shouldn't embarrass them. You shouldn't say things that are improper to them. I think that's a lesson we have to take away from this. That it's not, even though the Chazal tell us it refers to Torah mitzvahs, and it does Torah mitzvahs. That's what the pasuk means. But again, Chazal enlarges these concepts to include other people as well. So, all right, very good. So we'll stop here.